The steady hands at 2:47 in the morning, with a patient's heart failing under his hands and the whole operating room screaming, Dr. Elijah Warren realized that someone had swapped the medication in his tray and that if he trusted the labels the way he'd been trained to for 15 years, the man on his table would be dead in 90 seconds. If you've ever had your entire life come down to a single decision made in the space of one breath, you know the kind of night this was. Stay with me to the end, because what Elijah does next and what it costs him and how he makes them pay is a story worth every minute. And if you love watching a good man get pushed to the edge and refuse to fall, hit that subscribe button now, because we're just getting started. Let me tell you who Elijah Warren was before that night, so you understand what they tried to take. He was the best trauma surgeon at St. Ambrose Medical Center, and everyone knew it, which was precisely the problem. I was 40 years old, tall and unhurried, with the kind of calm that made panicking people go quiet just because he'd walked into the room. His hands were legendary. The nurses said he could tie a suture in the dark, and a couple of times he actually had when the power failed during a storm and a patient was bleeding out on the table. He had grown up in Detroit, the son of a bus mechanic and a school teacher, and he had clawed his way through college and medical school on scholarships and night shifts and a refusal to be anything less than undeniable. Because he had learned the way men like him always learned, that good enough was never going to be good enough. He had to be the best, or he'd be invisible. So he became the best. By the time this story starts, Elijah ran the night trauma service at St. Ambrose, the hardest shift in the hospital, the one where the car wrecks and the gunshot wounds and the falls came in without warning and without mercy. He was respected. I was in his quiet way, loved by the nurses and residents who'd learned that he'd take the blame when things went wrong and give away the credit when things went right. He was not rich, not by doctor standards. He sent money home to his mother and paid off loans that never seemed to shrink. But he had built a life of meaning with his own two steady hands, and he was proud of it. The people who worked the night service with him were the closest thing Elijah had to family, and they matter to this story, so let me name them. There was Rosa Delgado, his lead scrub nurse, 8 years at his side, a woman who could read his hands mid-surgery and have the next instrument in his palm before he asked. There was Dr. Priya Kim, a second-year resident so gifted and so overlooked that Elijah had made her his special project, staying late to teach her the things the textbooks skip because someone had once done that for him. There was Big Walt, the night shift charge nurse, a former Army medic who ran the trauma bay like a battlefield and loved Elijah with the gruff, wordless loyalty of a man who'd seen too much to waste words. And there was Yusuf, the overnight janitor, an Eritrean immigrant with 2 engineering degrees. His American licenses wouldn't honor, who mopped the trauma bay floors and talked with Elijah in the dead hours about everything under the sun, and who understood machines and systems in a way that would matter enormously before the end. These were Elijah's people. Preston Vale, counting his allies among the board and the donors, never once thought to count them. That was his first mistake. He had one enemy, though. For a long time he didn't understand how dangerous that enemy was. His name was Dr. Preston Vale, the hospital's chief of surgery, a man who had been handed everything Elijah had fought for. Preston came from a family of doctors. His father had a wing named after him. I was polished and charming and photographed beautifully for the hospital's fundraising materials, and he had risen not on the strength of his hands, which were merely adequate, but on the strength of his name, his politics, and his gift for making the right people comfortable. Preston Vale had learned early that in medicine, as in everything, the appearance of excellence was worth more than excellence itself, as long as no one who could tell the difference ever got too close to the truth. And Elijah Warren could tell the difference. That was the danger. Elijah was living proof that a man with no name and no connections could be better than a man with both. And Preston Vale could not tolerate that proof existing in his hospital on his service drawing, that kind of quiet loyalty from the staff. It wasn't personal at first. It became personal. It always does. The trouble began when the hospital started dying. St. Ambrose was in financial trouble, the way a lot of hospitals that serve the people who need them most are in financial trouble. And a private equity group had swept in with an offer to buy it. Their plan, dressed up in the language of efficiency and modernization, was simple: cut the expensive services, the trauma unit chief among them, and turn a hospital that saved poor people's lives into a boutique operation that billed rich people's elective procedures. Preston Vale had been promised a fortune and a seat on the board if he delivered the takeover quietly. And the one thing standing in the way was the trauma unit's stubborn excellence, its low mortality rates, its reputation, the impossible to argue with fact that people walked out of St. Ambrose alive who would have died anywhere else. And the reason for that fact had a name: Elijah Warren. So Preston needed Elijah gone, not just gone, discredited. Because if the best trauma surgeon in the state simply resigned, questions would be asked. But if he could be shown to be dangerous, reckless, a liability, then shutting down his unit would look like wisdom instead of greed. Which brings us back to 2:47 in the morning and the tray of swapped medication. The patient was a young man named Danny, a construction worker who'd fallen 3 stories and come in with internal bleeding and a blood pressure that was circling the drain. Elijah had him open on the table, was controlling the bleeding, stabilizing him, doing the impossible thing he did every night. And when the crisis peaked and he called for a specific medication, the vial the scrub nurse handed him, labeled correctly in the right place on the tray, was wrong. Elijah knew it was wrong the way you know your own name. The color was fractionally off. The viscosity, when he glanced at it, was not what it should have been. Everything in his training, in the protocols, in the whole architecture of hospital safety told him to trust the label. And everything in his hands, in the 15 years of muscle memory, told him the label was lying. He had one breath to decide: trust the system or trust himself. He trusted himself. He rejected the vial, called for a fresh one from a different sealed supply, drew it himself, and administered it. Danny's heart, which had been about to stop, steadied. The bleeding came under control, and a young construction worker who should have died on a table at 2:47 in the morning went on to walk his sister down the aisle 2 years later, though, of course, Elijah didn't know that yet. All he knew, standing in the cooling adrenaline after the case, was that someone had put a wrong medication in his tray, correctly labeled on the most dangerous shift in the hospital, and that this was not an accident. Now here is where I have to stop and ask you, because what happens next is where the real fight begins. If you're already on Elijah's side, and how could you not be, hit that subscribe button, because Preston Vale is about to learn what happens when you try to break a man who spent his whole life being unbreakable. Elijah did the right thing. He reported it. He filed an incident report, meticulous and precise, documenting exactly what had happened: a mislabeled wrong medication in his tray during a critical case. He assumed the hospital would investigate, would treat it as the near catastrophe it was, would want to find out how such a dangerous error had occurred. Instead, 3 days later, he was summoned to Preston Vale's office and told he was being placed under investigation. Not the incident, him. Preston sat behind his enormous desk in front of the window, with his name wing visible across the courtyard, and he wore an expression of grave, reluctant concern that Elijah would come to know very well. "Elijah," he said, "I'm going to be honest with you because I respect you. This incident report of yours has raised some serious questions. The pharmacy has no record of any mislabeling. The medication logs don't support your account. And frankly, the story you're telling a surgeon overriding the labeled medication in the middle of a critical case on nothing but a hunch is exactly the kind of dangerous cowboy behavior that gets patients killed. The patient survived, thank God. But if he hadn't, we'd be looking at a very different conversation." Elijah understood then, in one cold rush, the shape of the trap. They had swapped the medication, expecting one of 2 outcomes. Either Elijah trusted the label and killed his patient, in which case they had their reckless, dangerous surgeon, or Elijah caught it, in which case they would erase the evidence, deny the mislabeling ever happened, and paint him as an unstable surgeon who overrode protocols on paranoid hunches. Heads they win, tails he loses. It was elegant, it was vicious, and it was working because the pharmacy records had already been altered, and it was Elijah's word against a system that had been engineered to call him a liar. "You swapped it," Elijah said quietly, "or you had someone swap it, and now the records are gone." Preston's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes, the flicker of a man hearing a truth he'd hoped to keep buried. "That's an extraordinary accusation," he said smoothly, "and it's exactly the kind of paranoia I'm worried about. Elijah, I'm placing you on administrative leave pending review. It's for your own protection as much as the hospital's." They walked him out that afternoon. 15 years of nights of saved lives, of steady hands in the dark. And they walked him out past the residents he'd trained and the nurses who'd trusted him. And the story that began to circulate, carefully seated, was that Dr. Warren had cracked under the pressure, had become erratic, had nearly killed a patient with a reckless override, and then invented a conspiracy to cover it up. It's an old story and an ugly one, and it works because people would rather believe a man broke than believe the institution did. Elijah went home to his empty apartment and sat in the dark and felt the gravity pulling at him, the voice that had followed him his whole life. They were always going to do this. You were never really one of them. Good enough was never going to be good enough. I was suspended, possibly about to lose his license, his reputation in ruins, and the one thing he'd built his entire life on, being undeniably, unimpeachably excellent, had been turned into the weapon they were using to destroy him. What he didn't know, sitting in the dark, was that his people had not accepted the story for 1 second. Big Walt had been on shift the night of Danny's surgery, and Big Walt had spent 20 years as an army medic watching doctors work under fire, and he knew the way old soldiers know things, that a man who calmly rejects a medication and calls for a sealed replacement in the middle of a code is not a reckless cowboy. He is the opposite. He is the most careful person in the room. When Big Walt heard that Elijah had been walked out for recklessness, he said a word he didn't use in front of the residents, and then he started quietly keeping his own notes. Rosa had seen the unfamiliar pharmacy tech restock the tray, and it had bothered her at the time, and it bothered her more now. And Priya Kim, the resident Elijah, had spent 100 late nights teaching, refused to believe that the best surgeon she'd ever seen had simply cracked. These three, without any plan yet, without Elijah even knowing, had already begun to circle the truth. Preston had walked Elijah out of the building. He had not walked the truth out with him. It stayed behind in the memories of the people who did the real work, waiting for someone to give it a voice. And that is when Sarah Collins knocked on his door. Let me tell you about Sarah. She was the sister of Danny, the young construction worker Elijah had saved at 247 that morning. She was 34, an ICU nurse at a different hospital with red hair. She kept braided out of her face in the direct, unsentimental manner of a woman who had spent her career watching people live and die and had no patience left for anything false. She had grown up in a small town in Pennsylvania, the oldest of 5, the one who held everyone together. And she had come to St. Ambrose the morning after her brother's surgery, planning to thank the surgeon who saved him, only to be told he'd been suspended for reckless conduct. Sarah Collins was a nurse. She knew in her bones what it meant to override a labeled medication in the middle of a code. She knew that no sane surgeon does that on a whim, that you'd have to be certain, terribly certain. And that being right when you did it meant you'd caught something the entire system had missed. The official story didn't add up. A reckless surgeon doesn't save a patient by rejecting the medication that would have killed him. A reckless surgeon kills the patient. The very fact that Danny was alive was proof that Elijah's hunch had been correct, which meant the medication really had been wrong, which meant somebody was lying and it wasn't the surgeon. So she found Elijah's address and she knocked on his door. And when he opened it, exhausted and hollow-eyed, she said, "You saved my brother's life, and now they're calling you dangerous for it. I'm a nurse. I know that story is garbage. So I'm here to ask you what really happened, and then I'm going to help you prove it." Elijah stared at her. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." "Because my brother is breathing because of your hands," Sarah said. "And because I've spent 12 years watching administrators bury nurses and doctors who told inconvenient truths, and I'm so tired of watching the wrong people win." She lifted her chin. "Are you going to let me in, or are we going to do this in the hallway?" He let her in. "I want to be honest with you about what happened next, because I promised you this romance would grow slowly, and it did. That first night, and for many nights after, there was no romance at all. There was a legal pad and a pot of coffee and 2 people who refused to accept a lie, mapping out a conspiracy. Elijah was too wounded, too consumed by the fight to let himself feel anything but gratitude. And Sarah was too focused, too fierce to let herself be anything but useful. What grew between them grew in the cracks, in the small hours, in the way she'd catch him staring at his own hands and say, "Hey, those hands saved my brother. Don't you dare doubt them." It grew the way trust grows between people in a foxhole, which is the deepest way there is. But it took its time. If you want to see where it goes, and it goes somewhere beautiful, stay with me and hit subscribe. There was a night, 3 weeks into the fight, when it all nearly came apart, and it is the night Elijah would later say he fell in love, though he didn't know it then. They had hit a wall. A key record seemed lost, the intimidation was working, and Elijah, exhausted and hollowed out, said the thing he'd been circling for days: "Maybe I should just take the settlement." Preston's lawyers had quietly offered one a modest sum and a quiet resignation, no admission of anything in exchange for making it all go away. I could get a job at some other hospital somewhere, nobody's heard the story. Keep my head down, keep cutting. He said it like a man describing his own funeral. Sarah put down her pen. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something no one had done for Elijah Warren in a very long time. She got angry on his behalf. "No," she said, "absolutely not. You want to know what I see when I look at you? I see a man who has been told his whole life that good enough isn't good enough, that he has to be twice as excellent to be treated half as fair, and who went out and became the best trauma surgeon in the state anyway. And now the one time the system turns on you, you want to do the thing they've always wanted you to do, which is to make yourself smaller and disappear quietly so nobody's uncomfortable." Her voice cracked just slightly. "My brother is breathing because you refused to disappear at 2:47 in the morning. So don't you dare tell me you're going to disappear now, not while I'm still standing here." Elijah looked at this woman, this fierce, unsentimental nurse from a small town in Pennsylvania, who had walked into his life because he'd saved a stranger, and who was now standing in his kitchen refusing to let him quit, and he felt something crack open in his chest that he'd kept sealed for most of his adult life. I didn't say anything. He didn't take the settlement either. He picked the pen back up. And Sarah, seeing it, gave him a small, fierce nod, and something passed between them in that moment that neither of them was ready to name. There was a war on. But the foundation was pouring slow and sure, the way the strongest ones do. They started with what they could prove. The pharmacy records had been altered, but Sarah as a nurse understood hospital systems in a way Elijah as a surgeon never had. She knew that in a modern hospital, nothing happens without leaving a dozen electronic footprints, and that erasing one record almost always leaves another intact because the people covering their tracks never understand the systems, as well as the people who use them every day. The pharmacy dispensing log might be altered, but the automated dispensing cabinet kept its own separate access log. The medication's barcode scan done at the bedside was recorded in a different system than the pharmacy's. And the security cameras in the pharmacy corridor, while they didn't record. Inside the pharmacy recorded who went in and out and when. It was painstaking work and dangerous because they were doing it without access. Elijah suspended and Sarah working at a different hospital entirely. But they had allies. And this is the part that matters. Matters because a man like Elijah who gives away credit and takes the blame builds a kind of loyalty that men like Preston Vale never understand and can never buy. There was Rosa, a scrub nurse who'd worked with Elijah for 8 years and who had noticed on the night of the incident that a pharmacy tech she didn't recognize had restocked the trauma tray, which was not that tech's job. There was Dr. Kim, a young resident Elijah had mentored who still had access to the hospital systems and who was willing to risk her own career to pull the records that mattered. And there was improbably Danny himself, Sarah's brother, who insisted on doing something for the man who'd saved him, and who as a construction worker knew a thing or two about how buildings and their security systems actually worked, and who helped them understand the camera coverage in the pharmacy corridor. And there was Yusuf, the overnight janitor with 2 engineering degrees. American Board would honor who understood the hospital systems better than the people who'd installed them because he cleaned the rooms where the servers hummed, and he had the kind of mind that cannot look at a machine without understanding it. When Sarah explained what they needed, Yusuf's eyes lit up in a way Elijah had never seen the light of a brilliant man finally being asked to use his brilliance. It was Yusuf who explained that the automated dispensing cabinet kept a separate independent access log that the pharmacy software couldn't touch. It was Yusuf who knew that the bedside barcode scanners wrote to a different database entirely, and it was Yusuf who understood the exact retention schedule of the corridor security footage and warned them that it would be automatically overwritten in a matter of days, so that whatever they were going to save, they had to save now. Big Walt provided the muscle and the memory, his careful notes from the night of the incident lining up detail by detail with what the logs revealed. And Rosa quietly, formally wrote out a sworn statement describing the unfamiliar tech she'd seen, restocked the tray, dating it, signing it, making it real. Piece by piece, the truth Preston had tried to erase reassembled itself in the hands of the people he'd never bothered to count. But Preston was not blind, and when he sensed the ground shifting, he counterattacked with the viciousness of a cornered man. He couldn't touch Elijah directly anymore, so he went after the people helping him. Priya Kim was suddenly informed that her residency contract was under review, that her performance had raised concerns. A lie so transparent that it fooled no one and frightened everyone because Preston controlled her entire future in medicine with a stroke of his pen. Yusuf received a warning that the hospital was reviewing its contracts with the overnight custodial staff. And Sarah at her own hospital across the city got a strange threatening call, implying that her nursing license could face questions if she kept interfering in another institution's internal matters. It was intimidation naked and cruel. And for a few days it worked because these were people with everything to lose, and Preston had the power to take it. Priya came to Elijah in tears, terrified she'd thrown away the career she'd fought for. And Elijah, who knew exactly what it was to be a person with everything to lose and nothing to fall back on, told her the truest thing he knew. If you back out now, I will understand and I will never think less of you, and you should protect yourself. But I have to tell you what took me years to learn. The thing they're threatening to take from you, they can only take once. The thing you'd lose by staying silent, you'd lose every day for the rest of your life. Priya wiped her eyes. She stayed. They all stayed. Because that is the thing about people like Preston Vale. They understand fear, but they have never once understood what makes people brave. The picture came together slowly, then all at once. The unfamiliar pharmacy tech who'd restocked Elijah's tray had been hired 2 weeks before the incident and quit 3 days after. The automated dispensing cabinet's access log, which Preston's people had forgotten existed, showed that the correct medication had been removed, and minutes later a different medication returned to the same slot at a time that matched the tech's shift. The bedside barcode scan recorded in a system nobody had thought to alter showed that the medication scanned into Danny's chart did not match the medication that the pharmacy log claimed had been dispensed. And the security cameras in the corridor showed the phantom tech entering the pharmacy, and 20 minutes later showed someone else entering. Someone who had no business in the pharmacy at that hour. Someone whose face caught for 3 clear seconds under the fluorescent light belonged to a man with a wing named after his father, Preston Vale, in the pharmacy, on the night of the incident, at the exact time the records had been altered. They had him. But Elijah, who had spent his whole life learning that being right is not the same as being believed, knew that evidence alone was not enough. Preston Vale had the hospital's lawyers, the board's ear, and a private equity firm with a fortune riding on the takeover, all of whom would have every reason to bury the truth one more time. If Elijah simply handed his evidence to the hospital, it would vanish, and he would be finished painted as a disgraced surgeon making desperate defamatory accusations. He needed to make the truth impossible to bury, and for that, he needed the one thing Preston Vale had used against him, an audience. Now, before I tell you how Elijah turned the trap around, and it is so satisfying, let me ask you one more time. If you're on the edge of your seat, if you want to see Preston Vale get exactly what he's earned, hit that subscribe button because the reckoning is here. The hospital's disciplinary review board was scheduled to meet to decide Elijah's fate and to formally recommend the closure of the trauma unit, clearing the last obstacle to the takeover. It was meant to be a quiet, controlled proceeding. Preceding Preston, presiding the outcome predetermined. Elijah was permitted to attend and to speak in his own defense, which everyone assumed would be a formality, the last words of a broken man. Preston should have remembered something about Elijah Warren. The man did his best work at 2:47 in the morning, with everything falling apart and one breath to decide. Pressure was not his weakness. Pressure was his native element. Elijah walked into that board meeting with Sarah at his side and Dr. Kim and Rosa in the room, and in his hand everything they had found. But he did not simply present it to the board, who could have suppressed it. He had, in the days before, quietly done 2 other things. I had given the complete evidence, verified and documented, to a journalist, one who had been investigating the private equity firm's pattern of gutting community hospitals, and who understood exactly what a story this was. And he had made sure that Danny, the patient who was alive because of that 2:47 decision, was in the room, along with 3 other patients whose lives Elijah had saved, real people, breathing, present, undeniable. When it was Elijah's turn to speak, he did not defend himself. He told the truth plainly, the way he'd learned truth had a weight no lie could match. He laid out the evidence piece by piece, the dispensing cabinet log, the barcode scan, the phantom tech, and finally the security footage projected onto the wall of that quiet room of Preston Vale entering the pharmacy on the night a medication was swapped to either kill a patient or destroy a surgeon. The room went silent. Preston at the head of the table went very pale. "You engineered a situation," Elijah said, his voice steady, "where either my patient died giving you your reckless surgeon, or I caught it giving you your paranoid one. You gambled a man's life to get rid of me because I was the only thing standing between you and a payday for closing a unit that keeps poor people alive. You almost won." He looked around the room at the board, at the patients, at the woman beside him who had knocked on his door when he had nothing left. "But you made one mistake. You thought that if you took away my reputation, I'd have nothing. You forgot that I spent 15 years building something you can't erase and can't buy. You forgot that the people in this room are alive because of what I did in the dark, and they were always going to tell the truth about it." Preston tried even then to salvage it. He rose from the head of the table, summoning the smooth authority that had carried him his whole life, and he said, "This footage proves nothing. As chief of surgery, I have every reason to be in every part of this hospital, including the pharmacy. Dr. Warren is a suspended physician making desperate defamatory accusations, and I will not sit here and be slandered by a man who—" "Then explain the dispensing cabinet log," Elijah said quietly. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. "The one that runs on an independent system your people didn't know how to alter. It shows the correct medication removed and a different one returned to the same slot at 11:52 p.m. during the shift of a pharmacy tech who was hired 2 weeks before that night and quit 3 days after, and who no one in this hospital can seem to locate. Explain why the medication scanned into my patient's chart at the bedside does not match what the pharmacy claims it dispensed. Explain the sworn statement from a scrub nurse with 8 years of service who watched that phantom tech restock my tray." He laid each document on the table as he spoke one after another. The way a surgeon lays out instruments before a procedure, he knows exactly how to perform. "You didn't come to the pharmacy that night for a routine reason, Dr. Vale. You came at 12:14 a.m., 22 minutes after the medication was swapped to make sure it was done. I have the footage, I have the logs, and I have every person in this room who is alive because I trusted my hands instead of your labels." The board members were no longer looking at Elijah. They were looking at Preston. And Preston Vale, the man with a wing named after his father, made the mistake that arrogant men make at the very end. He looked for one unguarded second afraid. And everyone in that room saw it. The journalist's story broke that same day. And the truth finally was louder than the lie. The unraveling was total. The security footage and the dispensing logs were beyond dispute. The phantom pharmacy tech tracked down by the authorities cut a deal and confirmed that Preston Vale had hired him to swap the medication. The private equity firm exposed pulled out of the takeover rather than be associated with a scandal involving a doctor who had deliberately endangered a patient's life. And Preston Vale, the man with a wing named after his father, was stripped of his position, his medical license, and when the criminal charges came, his freedom. Endangering a patient's life to advance a business deal is not a thing. Even the best lawyers and the oldest names can smile away. The last time Elijah saw him, Preston was being escorted out of the hospital, past the residents and the nurses, exactly the way he had once walked Elijah out. He tried to say something, some final justification. Elijah didn't wait to hear it. He had a patient to see, because that was the ending that mattered most. Elijah Warren was reinstated with a formal apology with the trauma unit, not just saved, but expanded with a new understanding across the whole hospital of exactly what his hands were worth. He was offered Preston's job, chief of surgery, and he thought about it seriously, and then he turned it down, because he had realized that his place was not behind an enormous desk in front of a window with his name on it. His place was in the trauma bay at 2:47 in the morning, where the car wrecks and the gunshot wounds came in without mercy, where a man with steady hands could stand between a stranger and the dark. That was the work. That had always been the work. But he didn't walk away from leadership entirely, because he understood now that the reason Preston Vale had been able to do what he did was that no one with a conscience had been willing to sit at the table where the decisions got made. So Elijah took a seat on the board instead of the corner office, one voice in the room where hospitals decide whether to serve the people who need them or the people who can pay. And he used that voice night shift after night shift to make sure St. Ambrose never again forgot what it was for. He also did one more thing. He created a fund, small at first, then larger, to help people like Yusuf, immigrants and strivers whose credentials the system refused to honor, get the certifications, and the second chances that would let America finally use the brilliance it had imported and ignored. He named it after his father, the bus mechanic, the man who had taught him that a thing worth fixing is worth fixing right, and who had never once in his life been given the chance Elijah was now giving to others. And the people who had risked everything were made whole because Elijah, restored to influence, used it first for them. Priya Kim's residency review vanished, and in its place came the recognition she'd been denied for years. Elijah made sure she was named chief resident, and she would go on to become one of the finest trauma surgeons the region ever produced, teaching her own residents the thing Elijah had taught her. Big Walt got the charge nurse position on the expanded trauma unit, and a raise that acknowledged at last what 20 years of battlefield calm was worth. Rosa was honored publicly for the sworn statement that had helped crack the case, and Yusuf, the janitor with 2 engineering degrees, got the thing no one in America had been willing to give him. Elijah went to the hospital's new leadership, told them the man who'd saved the institution's soul was mopping its floors, and did not stop until Yusuf had a position in the biomedical engineering department, using the brilliance the country had wasted for a decade. Yusuf wept when he got the offer. He told Elijah it was the first time since he'd arrived that anyone had looked at him and seen what he could do instead of where he'd come from. Elijah told him he knew that feeling better than Yusuf could imagine. And Sarah, it grew slowly the way I promised, through all those nights over the legal pad and the cold coffee, through the fear and the fight. Something had been quietly steadying between them, the way a patient steadies under the right hands. But it was only after it was over, after the reckoning, when Elijah was back on his service and Sarah had transferred to St. Ambrose to run the ICU, that he finally said the thing he'd been carrying. They were standing on the roof of the hospital at the end of a shift, watching the sun come up over the city, and Elijah said, "You knocked on my door when I had nothing. You believed in my hands when I'd stopped believing in them myself. I've been trying to figure out how to thank you, and I keep landing on the same problem, which is that thank you isn't the word." Sarah looked at him, this fierce, direct woman who had never once let him doubt himself, and she smiled. "Then find a better word." He did. He kissed her on the roof in the first light, with the whole exhausted, saved, imperfect city spread out below them. And when they finally broke apart, Sarah looked at him with those clear, unsentimental eyes and said the truest thing anyone had said to him in a year. For the record, I didn't fall for the best trauma surgeon in the state. I fell for the man who was ready to disappear quietly to keep everybody comfortable and chose not to. That's the one I want. The one who almost quit and didn't. Elijah laughed a real laugh, the kind he'd forgotten he had in him, and told her that was the most backhanded declaration of love he'd ever heard, and she told him to get used to it because she planned to keep him honest for a very long time. She kept that promise. They built a life together after that, 2 people who had spent their careers standing between strangers and the dark, now doing it side by side. Danny recovered fully, and 2 years later at his own wedding gave a toast to the surgeon who'd saved his life and the sister who'd saved the surgeon, and there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Rosa and Dr. Kim were promoted, their loyalty repaid, and on the wall of the trauma bay, where every resident could see it during the long nights, Elijah hung a small sign hand-lettered that said simply, "Trust your hands." It was the lesson the whole ordeal had burned into him, and it was the lesson he passed on, the reason a generation of surgeons trained at St. Ambrose would learn to trust the truth in their hands even when the system told them to doubt it. Danny stood up for Elijah at the wedding, the young construction worker who had been the reason for all of it, alive and strong and grinning, and in his toast he said the thing that put the whole room in tears. 2 people saved my life that year. The man who wouldn't trust the label and my sister who wouldn't let him quit. And then, because the world has a sense of humor, they saved each other. He raised his glass. To the steadiest hands I ever met and the stubbornest heart, and the fact that they finally figured out they belonged to the same story. They married on the hospital roof the following year at dawn, at the exact spot where he'd found the better word. Sarah's 4 siblings came. Big Walt gave her away because Sarah's own father had passed years before, and Big Walt said it was the greatest honor of a life that had seen a lot of them. Priya Kim was there, and Rosa and Yusuf in a suit he'd bought for the occasion, and half the night trauma service, besides the people who had refused to believe a lie and had rebuilt the truth with their own hands. Elijah's mother came and cried and told Sarah that her son had always been the best, that she'd known it from his earliest days. Always the one who fixed things nobody else could fix, and now finally the whole world knew it too. They tried to break Dr. Elijah Warren by turning his greatest strength into the weapon against him. They forgot that a man who does his finest work under the worst pressure cannot be broken by making things worse. Every trap they set he turned. Every lie they told the truth eventually swallowed. And in the end he had more than his license and his unit and his cleared name. Hannah had a partner who had believed in his hands before she believed in anything else, and a life of meaning built with those same steady hands and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that on the worst night of his life at 2:47 in the morning, with everything on the line, he had trusted himself, and he had been right. Preston Vale, meanwhile, learned the lesson the hard way, the way his kind always does at the very end. He had spent a career believing that a name on a wing and a seat at the right tables made a man untouchable, that excellence could be purchased or inherited, or when necessary, framed out of existence. He discovered too late that the one thing he had never bothered to acquire, the loyalty of the people who do the actual work, was the only thing that could have saved him, and it was the very thing arrayed against him at the end. He went to prison a man who had never once in his whole gilded life held a stranger's life steady in his hands and been trusted to. That's the story of the steady hands. They shook once in the dark, but they never once let go. If this story got to you, if you cheered when Preston was walked out and smiled when Elijah found his better word, do me a favor. Hit subscribe, tell me in the comments the moment that hit hardest, and share this with someone who needs to hear that the ones who get pushed to the edge don't always fall. Sometimes they turn around and change everything. I'll see you in the next one.